Chapter 2. Haunted Houses in Cohn's Half. From a very early period, a division of Ireland into two halves existed. This was traditionally believed to have been made by Cohn, the 100 fighter, and Narrated in AD 166. The north was in consequence known as Cohn's Half, the south as Mo's Half, the line of division being a series of gravel hills extending from Dublin to Galway. This division we have followed, except that we have included the whole of the counties of Westmeath and Galway in the northern portion. We had hoped originally to have had 4 chapters on haunted houses, one for each of the 4 provinces, but from lack of material from Cohn, we have been forced to adopt the plan in which chapters 1 to 3 are arranged. Mrs. Atchison of County Roscommon sends the following: Emo House, County Westmeath, a very old mansion since pulled down, was purchased by my grandfather for his son, my father. The latter had only been living in it for a few days when knocking commenced at the hall door. Naturally, he thought it was someone playing tricks or endeavoring to frighten him away. One night he had the lobby window open directly over the door. The knocking commenced, and he looked out. It was a very bright night, and as there was no porch, he could see the door distinctly. The knocking continued, but he did not see the knocker move. Another night he sat up expecting his brother, but as the latter did not come, he went to bed. Finally, the knocking became so loud and insistent that he felt sure his brother must have arrived. He went downstairs and opened the door, but no one was there. Still convinced that his brother was there and had gone round to the yard to put up his horse, he went out, but scarcely had he gone 20 yards from the door when the knocking recommenced behind his back. On turning around, he could see no one. After this, the knocking got very bad, so much so that he could not rest. After this time he did not mention the strange occurrence to anyone. One morning he went up through the fields between 4 and 5 o'clock. To his surprise he found the herd out feeding the cattle. My father asked him why he was up so early. He replied that he could not sleep. "Why?" asked my father. "You know why yourself, sir, the knocking." He then found that this man had heard it all the time, though he slept at the end of the long house. My father was advised to take no notice of it, for it would go as it came, though at this time it was continuous and very loud, and so it did. The county people said it was the late resident who could not rest. We had another curious and most eerie experience in this house. A former rector was staying the night with us, and as the evening wore on, we commenced to tell ghost stories. He related some remarkable experiences, and as we were talking, the drawing-room door suddenly opened as wide as possible, and then slowly closed again. It was a calm night, and at any rate it was a heavy double door, which never flies open, however strong the wind may be blowing. Everyone in the house was in bed, as it was after 12 o'clock, except for the 3 persons who witnessed this, viz. myself, my daughter, and the rector. The effect on the latter was most marked. He was a big, strong, jovial man and a good athlete, but when he saw the door open he quivered like an aspen leaf. A strange story of a haunting in which nothing was seen, but in which the same noises were heard by different people, is sent by one of the participants, who does not wish to have her name disclosed. She said, "When staying for a time in a country house in the north of Ireland some years ago, I was awakened on several nights by hearing the tramp, tramp of horses' hoofs. Sometimes it sounded as if they were walking on paving stones, while at other times I had the impression that they were going round a large space, and as if someone was using a whip on them. I heard neighing and the champing of bits, and so formed the impression that they were carriage horses. I did not mind it much at first, as I thought the stables must be near to that part of the house. After hearing these noises several times, I began to get curious. So one morning I made a tour of the place. I found that the side of the house I occupied overlooked a neglected garden, which was mostly used for drying clothes. I also discovered that the stables were right at the back of the house, and so it would be impossible for me to hear any noises in that quarter. At any rate, there was only one farm horse left, and this was securely fastened up every night. Also, there were no cobblestones round the yard. I mentioned what I had heard to the people of the house, but they would give me no satisfactory reply. I passed it over. I did not hear these noises every night. One night I was startled out of my sleep by hearing a dreadful disturbance in the kitchen. It sounded as if the dish covers were being taken off the walls and dashed violently on the flagged floor. At length I got up and opened the door of my bedroom, and just as I did so, an appalling crash resounded through the house. I waited to see if there was any light to be seen, or footstep to be heard, but nobody was stirring. There was only one servant in the house, the other persons being my host, his wife, and a baby, who had all retired early. Next morning I described the noises in the kitchen to the servant, and she said she had often heard them. I then told her about the tramping of horses. She replied that she herself had never heard it, but that other persons who had occupied my room had had experiences similar to mine. I asked her if there was any explanation. She said no, except that a story was told of a gentleman who had lived there some years ago and was very much addicted to racing and gambling, and that he was shot one night in that house. For the remainder of my visit I was removed to another part of the house, and I heard no more noises. A house in the north of Ireland near that locality, which is eternally famous as having furnished the material for the last trial for witchcraft in the country, is said to be haunted, the reason being that it is built on the site of a disused and very ancient graveyard. It is said that when some repairs were being carried out, 9 human skulls were unearthed. It would be interesting to ascertain how many houses in Ireland are traditionally said to be built on such unpleasant sites, and if they all bear the reputation of being haunted. The present writer knows of one in the south, which is so situated, and this is supported to a certain extent by documentary evidence from the 13th century down, and which, in consequence, has an uncanny reputation. But concerning the above house, it has been found almost impossible to get any information. It is said that strange noises were frequently heard there, which sometimes seemed as if cartloads of stones were being run down one of the gables. On one occasion an inmate of the house lay dying upstairs. A friend went up to see the sick person, and on proceeding to pass through the bedroom door, was pressed and jostled as if by some unseen person, hurriedly leaving the room. On entering, it was found that the sick person had just passed away. An account of a most unpleasant haunting is contributed by Mr. W. S. Thompson, who vouches for the substantial accuracy of it, and also furnishes the names of 2 men, still living, who attended this station. We give it as it stands, with the comment that some of the details seem to have been grossly exaggerated by local raconteurs. In the year 1869, a ghost made its presence manifest in the house of a Mr. M. in County Cohn. In the daytime it resided in the chimney, but at night it left its quarters, and subjected the family to considerable annoyance. During the day they could cook nothing, as showers of soot would be sent down the chimney on top of every pot and pan that was placed on the fire. At night, the various members of the family would be dragged out of bed by the hair and pulled around the house. When anyone ventured to light a lamp, it would be immediately put out, while chairs and tables would be sent dancing round the room. At last matters reached such a pitch that the family found it impossible to remain any longer in the house. The night before they left, Mrs. M. was severely handled, and her boots left facing the door as a gentle hint for her to be off. Before they departed, some of the neighbors went to the house, saw the ghost, and even described to Mr. Thompson what they had seen. According to one man, it appeared in the shape of a human being with a pig's head with long tusks. Another described it as a horse with an elephant's head, and a headless man seated on its back. Finally, a station was held at the house by 7 priests, at which all the neighbors attended. The station commenced after sunset, and everything in the house had to be uncovered lest the evil spirit should find any resting place. A free passage was left out the door onto the street, where many people were kneeling. About 5 minutes after the station opened, a rumbling noise was heard, and a black barrel rolled out with an unearthly din, though to some coming up the street it appeared in the shape of a black horse with a bull's head, and a headless man seated thereon. From this time the ghost gave no further trouble. The same gentleman also sends an account of a haunted shop in which members of his house had some very unpleasant experiences. In October 1882, my father, William Thompson, took over the grocery and spirit business from a Dr. S., to whom it had been left by will. My sister was put in charge of the business, and she slept on the premises at night, but she was not there by herself very long until she found things amiss. The 3rd night, matters were made so unpleasant for her that she had to get out of bed more dead than alive, and go across the street to Mrs. M., the servant at the RIC barrack, with whom she remained until the morning. She stated that as she lay in bed, half awake and half asleep, She saw a man enter the room, who immediately seized her by the throat and well-nigh choked her. She had only sufficient strength left to gasp, "Lord, save me," when instantly the man vanished. She also said that she heard noises as if every bottle and glass in the shop was smashed to atoms. Yet in the morning everything would be found intact. My brother was in charge of the shop one day, as my sister had to go to Belturbet to do some Christmas shopping. He expected her to return to the shop that night, but as she did not do so, he was preparing to go to bed about 1 a.m., when suddenly a terrible noise was heard. The light was extinguished, and the tables and chairs commenced to dance about the floor, and some of them struck him on the shins. Upon this he left the house, declaring that he had seen the devil. Possibly this ghost had been a rabid teetotaler in the flesh, and continued to have a dislike to the publican's trade after he had become discarnate. At any rate, the present occupants, who follow a different avocation, do not appear to be troubled. Ghosts are no respecters of person or places, and take up their quarters where they are least expected. One can hardly imagine them entering an R.I.C. barrack, and annoying the stalwart inmates thereof. Yet more than one tale of a haunted police barrack has been sent to us. Nay, in its proper place we shall relate the appearance of a deceased member of the force, uniform and all. The following personal experiences are contributed by an ex-R.I.C. constable, who requested that all names should be suppressed. The barrack of which I am now about to speak has now disappeared, owing to the construction of a new railway line. It was a 3-story house with large area apartments and splendid accommodation. This particular night I was on guard. After the constables had retired to their quarters, I took my palliasse down to the day room and laid it on 2 forms alongside 2 6-foot tables, which were placed end to end in the center of the room. As I expected a patrol in at midnight, and as another had to be sent out when it arrived, I didn't promise myself a very restful night, so I threw myself on the bed, intending to read a bit, as there was a large lamp on the table. Scarcely had I commenced to read when I felt as if I was being pushed off the bed. At first I thought I must have fallen asleep, so to make sure I got up, took a few turns around the room, and then deliberately lay down again and took up my book. Scarcely had I done so, when the same thing happened, and though I resisted with all my strength, I was finally landed on the floor. My bed was close to the table, and the pushing came from that side, so that if anyone was playing a trick on me, they could not do so without being under the table. I looked, but there was no visible presence there. I felt shaky, but changed my couch to another part of the room, and had no further unpleasant experience. Many times after I was guard in the same room, but I always took care not to place my couch in that particular spot. One night long afterwards, we were all asleep in the dormitory, when we were awakened in the small hours of the morning by a guard, rushing upstairs, dashing through the room, jumping into a bed on the farthest corner behind its occupant. There he lay gasping, unable to speak for several minutes, and even then we couldn't get a coherent account of what befell him. It appears he fell asleep, and suddenly awoke to find himself on the floor, and a body rolling over him. Several men volunteered to go upstairs with him, but he absolutely refused to leave the dormitory, and stayed there till morning. Nor would he even remain downstairs at night without having a comrade with him. It ended in his applying for an exchange of stations. Another time I turned off duty at midnight, and after my comrade, a married sergeant, had gone outside to his quarters, I went to the kitchen to change my boots. There was a good fire on, and it looked so comfortable that I remained toasting my toes on the hob and enjoying my pipe. The lock-up was a lean-to in 1-story building off the kitchen, and was divided into 2 cells, one opening into the kitchen, the other into that cell. I was smoking away when suddenly I heard inside the lock-up a dull, heavy thud, just like the noise of a drunken man would make by crashing down on all fours. I wondered who the prisoner could be, as I didn't see anyone that night who seemed a likely candidate for free lodgings. However, as I heard no other sound, I decided I would tell the guard in order that he might look after him. As I took my candle from the table, I happened to glance at the lock-up, and to my surprise, I saw that the outer door was open. My curiosity being roused, I looked inside to find the inner door also open. There was nothing in either cell except the 2 empty plank beds, and these were immovable, as they were firmly fixed to the walls. I betook myself to my bedroom much quicker than I was in the habit of doing. I mentioned that this barrack was demolished owing to the construction of a new railway line. It was the last obstacle removed, and in the meantime workmen came from all points of the compass. One day a powerful navvy was brought into the barrack, a total collapse from drink, and absolutely helpless. After his neckwear was loosened, he was carried to the lockup and laid on a plank bed, the guards being instructed to visit him periodically lest he should smother. He was scarcely half an hour there. This was in the early evening, when the most unmerciful screaming brought all hands to the lockup to find the erstwhile helpless man standing on a plank bed and grappling with a, to us, invisible foe. We took him out, and he maintained that a man had tried to choke him and was still there when we came to his relief. The strange thing was that he was shivering with fright and perfectly sober, although in the ordinary course of events he would not be in that condition for at least 7 or 8 hours. The story spread like wildfire throughout the town, but the inhabitants were not in the least surprised, and one old man told us that many strange things happened in that house long before it became a police barrack. A lady who requests her name be suppressed relates a strange sight seen by her sister in Galway. The latter's husband was stationed in that town about 17 years ago. One afternoon he was out, and she was lying on a sofa in the drawing-room, when suddenly from behind a screen, where there was no door, came a little old woman with a small shawl over her head and shoulders, such as the country women used to wear. She had a most diabolical expression on her face. She seized the lady by the hand and said, "I will drag you down to hell where I am." The lady sprang up in terror and shook her off, when the horrible creature again disappeared behind the screen. The house was an old one, and many stories were rife amongst the people about it, and one of the most to the point being that the apparition of an old woman, who was supposed to have poisoned someone, used to be seen therein. Needless to say, the lady in question never again sat by herself in the drawing-room. 2 stories are told about haunted houses in Drogheda, the one by A.G. Bradley in Notes on Some Irish Superstitions, and the other by F.G. Lee in Sights and Shadows. As both appear to be placed in the same date, i.e. 1890, it is quite possible that they refer to one and the same haunting, and we have so treated them accordingly. The reader, if he wishes, can test the matter for himself. This house, which was reputed to be haunted, was let to a tailor and his wife by the owner of an annual rent of £23. They took possession in due course, but after a very few days they became aware of the presence of a most unpleasant supernatural lodger. One night, as the tailor and his wife were preparing to retire, they were terrified at seeing the foot of some invisible person kick the candlestick off the table, and so quench the candle. Although it was a very dark night and the shutters were closed, the man and his wife could see everything in the room just as well as if it were in the middle of the day. All at once a woman entered the room, dressed in white, carrying something in her hand, which she threw at the tailor's wife, striking her with some violence, and then vanished. While this was taking place on the first floor, a most frightful noise was going on overhead in the room where the children and their nurse were sleeping. The father immediately rushed upstairs and found to his horror the floor all torn up, the furniture broken, and worst of all, the children lying senseless and naked on the bed, and having the appearance of having been severely beaten. As he was leaving the room with the children in his arms, he suddenly remembered that he had not seen the nurse, so turning back with the intention of bringing her downstairs, but could not find her anywhere. The girl, half dead with fright and very much bruised, had fled to her mother's house, where she died in a few days in agony. Because of these occurrences, they were legally advised to refuse to pay any rent. The landlady, however, declined to release them from their bargain, and at once claimed a quarter's rent, and when this remained for some time unpaid, sued them for it before Judge Kisby. A Drogheda solicitor appeared for the tenants, who, having given evidence of the facts concerning the ghost in question, asked to leave to support their sworn testimony by that of several other people. This, however, was disallowed by the judge. It was admitted by the landlady that nothing on one side or the other had been said regarding the haunting when the house was let. A judgment was consequently entered for the landlady, although it had been shown indirectly that, unquestionably, the house had had a reputation of being haunted, and that previous tenants had been much inconvenienced. This chapter may be concluded with 2 stories dealing with the haunted rectories. The first and mildest of these is contributed by the present Dean of St. Patrick's. It is not his own personal experience, but was related to him by a rector in County Monaghan, where he used to preach on special occasions. The rector and his daughters told the dean that they had often seen in that house the apparition of an old woman dressed in a drab cape, while they frequently heard noises. On one evening the rector was in the kitchen together with the cook and the coachman. All three heard noises in the pantry as if vessels were being moved. Presently they saw the old woman in the drab cape come out of the pantry and move up the stairs. The rector attempted to follow her, but two of the servants held him tightly by the arms and besought him not to do so. But hearing the children, who were in bed, screaming, he broke off from the grip of the servants and rushed upstairs. The children said that they had been frightened by seeing a strange old woman coming into the room, but she was now gone. The house had a single roof, and there was no way to or from the nursery except by the stairs. The rector stated that he took to praying that the old woman might have rest, and that it was now many years since she had been seen. A very old parishioner told him that when she was young, she remembered having seen an old woman answering to the rector's description, who had lived in the house, which at that time was not a rectory. The second of these, which is decidedly more complex and mystifying, refers to a refectory in County Donegal. It is sent as the personal experience of one of the recipients who do not wish to have his name disclosed. He says, "My wife, children, and myself will have lived here for 4 years next January, 1914. From that first night that we came into the house, the most extraordinary noises have been heard. Sometimes they were inside the house, and seemed as if the furniture was being disturbed, and the fire irons knocked about, or at other times as if a dog was running up and down the stairs. Sometimes they were external, and resembled tin buckets being dashed about the yard, as if a herd of cattle was galloping up the drive before the windows. These things would go on for 6 months, and then everything would be quiet for 3 months or so, when the noises would commence again. My dogs, a fox terrier, a boarhound, and a spaniel, would make a terrible din, and would bark at something in the hall we could not see, backing away from it all the time. The only thing that was ever seen was as follows. One night my daughter went down to the kitchen about 10 o'clock for some hot water. She saw a tall man with one arm carrying a lamp, who walked out of the pantry into the kitchen and then through the kitchen wall. Another daughter saw the same man walk down one evening from the loft and go into the harness room. She told me, and I went out immediately, but could see nobody. Shortly after that, my wife, who is very brave, heard a knock at the hall door in the dusk. Naturally thinking it was some friend, she opened the door, and there saw standing outside the self-same man. He simply looked at her and walked through the wall into the house. She got such a shock that she could not speak for several hours, and was ill for some days. That is 18 months ago, and he has not been seen since, and it is 6 months since we have heard any noises. Our correspondence letter was written on the 25th of November, 1913. An old man nearly 90 died last year. He lived all his life within 400 yards of his house, and used to tell me that 70 years ago the parsons came with a bell, book, and candle to drive the ghosts out of the house. Evidently they were unsuccessful. In English ghost stories, it is the parson who performs the exorcism successfully, while in Ireland such work is generally performed by the priest. Indeed, a tale was sent us in which a ghost quite ignored the parson's efforts, but succumbed to the priest. End of chapter 2.